When you first learn to ride a bicycle, uh, there's this incredible, almost illusionary sense of safety that comes from those little training wheels attached to the back tire.
Oh, yeah. They are a lifesaver when you're a kid.
Right, because they're physical. Right, they're visible.
Yeah.
And they absolutely guarantee that no matter how much you wobble, no matter how terribly you shift your weight, you are just not going to hit the pavement.
Exactly. It's basically a binary state of existence. You are upright or you are not, and it's deeply comforting.
We really like that safety net. I mean, we like knowing that an external mechanism is protecting us from the consequences of our own lack of balance.
It's a very tangible form of support. And, I mean, from a developmental standpoint, it serves a real purpose.
For sure.
When you have those training wheels on, you don't really have to think about the complex physics of balance or momentum or spatial awareness because the mechanism is doing all the heavy lifting for you.
You're just pedaling.
Right, you're moving forward, yes, but you aren't actually navigating. You are just pedaling within a rigidly controlled environment.
But then comes that terrifying day, when the training wheels come off. The parent unbolts them, and suddenly you are completely responsible for your own balance.
And that's when gravity gets real.
Exactly. You have to understand how your forward momentum, your subtle steering adjustments, and the speed of your pedaling all interact in real time. The safety net is entirely gone.
Completely gone.
And the landscape of riding that bike becomes, honestly, a lot more complex and daunting. If you lean too far, you fall. If you stop pedaling, you fall. The pain of hitting the asphalt is suddenly a very real, immediate consequence of your own actions.
Which is the absolute definition of moving from a state of total dependency to a state of independent responsibility. I mean, it is a profound paradigm shift.
Yeah, it really is.
You transition from being a passive participant in your own movement to being an active, accountable driver. The physical world hasn't changed, right? Gravity is still gravity. The road is still the road. But your relationship to the rules of that world has fundamentally transformed.
Welcome back to the show, learner. Today, we are exploring a transformation that is exactly like taking those training wheels off, but on a civilizational scale.
That's a great way to put it.
We are looking at an incredibly dense, fascinating, and highly philosophical lecture from the Tolu-e-Islam series. Specifically, we are unpacking Lecture 15 of 17, which covers the grand finale of Surah 17 of the Quran, also known as Al-Isra, covering verses 94 all the way to 111.
And this is a massive section to cover.
Huge. And now, before we really wade into these waters, we need to establish some crucial context about what we are actually looking at. Because, listen, this is not your standard weekend theological sermon.
No, far from it. We need to be very clear about the framework of this specific deep dive. The source material we are examining today presents a highly rationalist philosophical interpretation of the Quran.
Delivered by the 20th century scholar G.A. Parwez, right?
Yes. The Tolu-e-Islam movement he founded was fundamentally focused on stripping away what he viewed as centuries of mystical, purely ritualistic, or culturally inherited baggage.
He wanted to uncover something more practical.
Exactly. He wanted to uncover a practical, socio-economic, and political constitution within the text itself.
And just so we are totally transparent with you, learner, our stance here is strictly as your expert guides through this specific text. We're exploring a highly specific intellectual framework today.
Right, we're acting as a lens for the material.
Yeah, we aren't here to endorse the theological claims, validate the historical interpretations, or take sides in the broader religious debates surrounding this rationalist approach. Our mission is just to immerse you in the ideas exactly as they are contained in the original source material.
To map out the terrain of this philosophy impartially?
Exactly. To see how its internal logic holds up. We are mapping the territory, not telling you where to build your house.
That's a vital distinction. And the territory we are mapping today has a massive overarching theme vibrating through all of these final verses of Surah 17.
So what's the core thesis here?
The core thesis of this lecture is the majesty of a self-sustaining rational law. It is fundamentally a text about human evolution.
But not biological evolution, right?
No. He is talking about intellectual and societal evolution. He is detailing humanity's transition from its intellectual childhood.
Like the training wheels.
Yes, exactly like that. An era the text characterizes as a long, primitive period of relying on physical miracles, magical thinking, and constant supernatural spoon-feeding, and moving from that into its intellectual adulthood.
Okay, let's unpack this. So childhood to adulthood, the training training wheels coming off. This adulthood, as I understand the source, is defined as an era where human intellect, reason, and an unbreakable system of cause and effect are supposed to govern society.
Rather than waiting for lightning bolts from the sky to solve our problems, yes, that is the central proposition. The speaker argues that the Quranic message in these final verses of Surah 17 is a declaration that the era of magical intervention is just over.
Humanity is being told to grow up.
Exactly. To look at the universe as a system of predictable social physics and to take ultimate responsibility for its own survival or destruction.
Which brings us right to the specific verses the lecture kicks off with. Verses 94 and 95 set up a confrontation, right? The opponents of this new Quranic message in 7th century Arabia are pushing back, and they are making a very specific, almost indignant demand.
Yeah, they want a light show.
Right. They're essentially asking, if the creator of the universe really wanted to send us a message, why didn't he send a glowing, flawless angel?
Right.
Why is the messenger just a regular human being who walks in the markets and eats food?
And, it is a completely logical question if you are still operating from the mindset of humanity's childhood. In that primitive framework, divine communication must inherently be spectacular.
It has to be a blockbuster movie.
It has to be otherworldly. Right. It has to shatter the laws of physics to prove it is real. The opponents are essentially saying, we want the magic, we want the supernatural spectacle.
But the text's central thesis utterly rejects this demand. It argues that sending a miracle-working angel would be worse than useless for human social development.
Exactly.
But wait, let's play devil's advocate for a second. Humans are emotional, visual creatures. If an angel descended from the clouds right now, radiating light, and handed humanity a perfect constitution for a just society, wouldn't that instantly solve all our debates?
You'd think so.
Right. Wouldn't that be the ultimate, undeniable proof that would force everyone to behave?
Well, it might force compliance through terror or awe for a brief moment, but it would completely fail to establish a functional, enduring human society.
Why?
The source explains this by pointing out that an angel cannot serve as a laboratory example or a benchmark for human behavior. The argument hinges on a very simple, inescapable reality. Humanity lives on Earth within the confines of biology and economics.
We have physical needs. We get hungry, we get tired, we get angry, we have deep social conflicts. We experience grief, and we face constant economic anxieties about survival.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the nature of an angel. An angel, by definition, does not have a digestive system. It does not need to sleep.
Right.
It does not worry about paying rent or providing food for its offspring. It doesn't have a biological drive that can lead to greed or lust.
So it's playing on easy mode.
Exactly. Therefore, if an angel were to come down and demonstrate perfect patience or unwavering courage or absolute self-control in the face of temptation, a human being would look at that and simply say, well, of course you can do that. You are an angel.
You're programmed for it.
Right. You are biologically programmed for perfection. You do not feel the agonizing pressures that I feel.
The context is so completely mismatched that the example becomes totally invalid. It makes me think of a billionaire. Someone who has never had to look at a price tag in their life, giving a lecture to a single parent living paycheck to paycheck on how easy it is to budget and save money.
Oh, that's a brilliant analogy.
The single parent isn't going to be inspired by that. They're going to be insulted. The billionaire's perfection in saving money is irrelevant because they aren't playing the same game or dealing with the same baseline anxieties.
That is a phenomenal modern equivalent. The source argues that for a constitution of social justice and equitable living to be proven viable, it must be demonstrated by a being who shares the exact same physical, psychological, and economic vulnerabilities as the audience.
They have to have skin in the game.
Literally. The messenger must bleed when cut, must feel the pangs of hunger, must feel the temptation of power, and yet still choose to adhere to the rational law of justice.
So they can be a role model.
Exactly. Only then can a human observer say, if he can do it despite having the same flaws and fears as I do, then it is possible for me and it is possible for our society.
So the messenger has to be a human benchmark.
Yes. To demonstrate how an equitable, rational human society should function. A human being is absolutely required. The source argues that recognizing this necessity marks the true adulthood of humanity.
It's the definitive end of relying on supernatural interventions or waiting for magical beings to solve our earthly, systemic problems.
Right, and the speaker in the text uses this incredible, culturally resonant analogy to drive this concept of maturity home. He talks about the concept of the finality of prophethood.
The idea that no more messengers are coming.
Yes, and he explains it through the lens of a railway station. He says that in the past, during humanity's infancy, people were so intellectually immature that they basically needed a station master sitting with them inside their own living rooms.
It is a really brilliant visualization. I mean, imagine being so incapable of managing your own schedule that every single time you wanted to know when the train was leaving, you couldn't just look it up.
We'd have to ask permission.
Yeah, you had to physically turn to this authoritative figure sitting in your house and ask, is it time yet? What do I do now?
And the station master would dictate every tiny detail of life: how to sit, what to eat, how to sleep, how to conduct every minor transaction. The source describes this as the era of religious childhood, where people needed constant step-by-step hand-holding because they hadn't developed the capacity for abstract, systematic reasoning.
But then, the lecture argues, a pivotal moment occurs in human history. Humanity finally matures. The cognitive capacity for rational thought, for understanding complex cause and effect relationships, it reaches a critical mass.
And with that maturity comes the finalized law. The era of the Quran is described as the moment the comprehensive timetable of human social physics is published and handed directly to humanity.
So the timetable's in our hands now.
Precisely. You do not need the station master sitting in your living room anymore. You have the comprehensive timetable, you have a clock on your wall, and most importantly, you have been endowed with the intellect to read both and synthesize the information.
You can figure out when the train leaves by yourself.
Yes. The source argues that when the opponents of the Quran demand a new messenger, or when they demand physical, magical miracles to prove the message, it is the equivalent of a grown, capable adult refusing to read the timetable in their own hands and instead throwing a tantrum, begging for the station master to come back and live in their house.
Okay, I want to push back on this a little bit because while the analogy is incredibly clean, the reality of human psychology is messy.
Oh, totally.
I mean, this newfound adulthood sounds empowering on paper, but doesn't it actually terrify people? Reading the timetable yourself means if you miss the train, if your society collapses into poverty or war, you cannot blame the station master.
You have no scapegoat.
Right. You cannot blame the universe. It is entirely 100% your fault. Isn't it just psychologically easier to ask for a miracle or to wait for a savior than to accept that crushing level of autonomy?
You have hit on the exact psychological resistance that the speaker highlights. The text explicitly confirms your suspicion. This level of adulthood is utterly terrifying.
Because being a child is safe.
Exactly. When you are a child, failure is someone else's fault. It is so much easier to say, oh, the station master didn't tell me, or God mysteriously misguided me, or, we can't fix our corrupt political system. We are just waiting for a divine savior to return and fix it for us.
Wow. It is the ultimate abdication of responsibility.
It is. The text argues that by demanding physical miracles, or by waiting passively for supernatural intervention, society is actively trying to avoid the exhausting, rigorous daily work of making rational decisions.
They don't want to build equitable systems.
No, they don't want to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. They want the benefits of a just society without doing the agonizing math required to build one.
Which introduces a massive problem. If humanity is now an adult holding the timetable, and we are entirely responsible for reading it correctly, how does this universe, this system of social physics, react when we misread it?
Or worse, when we intentionally ignore it.
Exactly. Because the immediate profits of ignoring it are too tempting. That leads us directly into the source's exploration of verses 97 to 99, which completely redefines what it means to have divine guidance or to go astray.
This is a highly controversial and intellectually rigorous section of the source material. The text looks at verse 97, which in traditional Orthodox translations is often rendered to mean something like, whomever God guides is guided, and whomever he leaves astray is astray.
Okay.
Now, the speaker notes that traditionalists have historically used this phrasing to argue for a kind of divine determinism, the idea that God arbitrarily, almost on a whim, misguides certain people, hardens their hearts, and destines them for failure.
But wait, if we take that traditional logic to its extreme, it completely destroys the idea of the timetable and the human responsibility we just spent all this time talking about.
It really does.
I mean, if the station master is actively sneaking into your house and changing the clocks while you aren't looking, how can you possibly be blamed for missing the train? It turns the whole system into a rigged game.
And that is exactly why the source fiercely rejects that traditional interpretation. The speaker argues that interpreting the verse as arbitrary divine interference makes a mockery of human intellect and nullifies the entire concept of accountability.
Because if you're forced to go astray, justice doesn't exist.
Exactly. If you are forced by an unseen hand, justice cannot exist. Instead, the speaker introduces what we can call the signpost analogy to explain the linguistic mechanics of the Quranic phrasing.
I was struck by how elegantly this analogy resolves the contradiction. Walk us through how the source explains the function of this signpost.
The speaker asks the listener to imagine standing at a fork in a road. God, as the ultimate lawgiver, has provided a perfectly clear, unmistakable signpost. The sign explicitly says, "The city of prosperity and peace is to the left, and the cliff of destruction is to the right." Now, the guidance is the provision of the signpost itself. The map has been given. But the choice of which path to take is left entirely to the human being.
So if you stand at that fork, read the signpost, but intentionally choose to walk down the right-hand path anyway, you're going to fall off the cliff.
Yes. And the crucial point the source makes is that you will fall off that cliff even if you hire 1,000 religious scholars to walk with you on that right-hand path.
Wow.
You can chant holy verses the entire time you are walking to the right, but the physical reality of the road will still lead you over the edge.
Because the physics of the road dictate the destination, not your wishes, and certainly not your empty rituals.
Precisely. Now, when you fall off that cliff, did God's law magically force you to go astray? Did a divine hand reach down and scramble your brain?
No, obviously not.
No. The natural mathematical consequence of ignoring the signpost is what led you to destruction. The text argues that when the Quran uses the linguistic expression "God misguides them," it is not talking about an emotional personal intervention. It is referring to God's established law of cause and effect.
It is a closed-loop system.
It is entirely closed. You input a destructive action into the system, say building an economy based on exploiting the poor, and the system mathematically outputs a destructive result, which is societal collapse.
And that inevitable collapse is the misguidance.
Yes. It is self-inflicted by choosing the wrong road, but it is executed by the immutable laws that govern human societies.
That is a massive shift in perspective, and frankly, a much more intimidating one.
It is terrifying.
It moves the concept of divine punishment from a personal emotional vendetta by an angry deity to a simple, unfeeling law of social physics. I mean, if you touch a visibly glowing hot stove, the stove isn't punishing you out of spite or anger.
Right, the stove doesn't have emotions.
It is simply transferring heat according to the laws of thermodynamics. Your burned hand is the natural consequence of ignoring the physics of heat.
And this realization leads directly into how the source redefines the concept of true faith, or iman. The text asks, why do people so vehemently deny this system of cause and effect, especially the ultimate accountability of the afterlife mentioned in verse 98?
Why do they deny it?
The speaker argues they deny it, or they create loopholes in it, simply to escape accountability in the here and now.
If you can convince yourself that the stove won't burn you, or that you have a magical spell that stops the heat, you can keep touching it.
Exactly. If there is no ultimate consequence, you can exploit people today with absolute impunity. Therefore, true faith, according to this rationalist text, is not just reciting a set of theological beliefs or checking a box on a religious census.
It's deeper than that.
Much deeper. True faith is the absolute, unshakable conviction in this mathematical law of accountability. It is the deeply internalized belief that every single action, no matter how small, has an unavoidable consequence that cannot be bribed, prayed, or wished away.
To illustrate what that internalized belief actually looks like in practice, the text gives a highly relatable, culturally specific example that really stuck with me.
The fasting example.
Yes, the example of fasting during the blistering heat of the summer months, like May or June.
It is a powerful illustration of the psychology of accountability. The speaker describes a person observing a fast during the absolute peak of summer heat in a place like South Asia.
And it gets incredibly hot there.
Unbearably hot. This person is completely alone in a room. The doors are bolted shut. The curtains are drawn. There is absolutely no human being who can see them. There are no security cameras.
Right.
And right in front of them, resting on a table, is a pitcher of ice-cold water.
Their throat is parched. They are sweating. They are suffering from extreme biological thirst. And yet, the text points out, They will not take a single drop of that water.
Not one drop. And why? Because of their internalized belief in an unseen law. The station master isn't in the room to slap their wrist.
The local police aren't there to arrest them. Society isn't there to judge them.
But the discipline holds. The text argues that that specific psychological state is the sheer power of true accountability.
Yeah.
It is that profound level of conviction where you behave ethically and adhere to the law, even when you are completely unobserved and the temptation to break it is biologically overwhelming.
It is a beautiful image of discipline. But here is the massive contradiction that the text itself points out, and I think anyone observing modern society has to wonder about this.
The paradox.
Right. The source mentions that millions of people perform these fasts. They show this incredible ironclad discipline with a glass of water in the locked room. But then the sun sets, the fast ends, and the next morning they walk out of that room and commit blatant crimes in society.
Yes, they do.
They lie in their business transactions, they exploit their workers, they engage in political corruption, they hoard wealth while their neighbors starve. So if the fast is supposed to be this ultimate training ground for building a perfect, unbreakable discipline of accountability, why does the source say it fails so spectacularly in the real world?
That paradox is the tragedy the speaker highlights. The text argues that over centuries, a massive, fatal disconnect has occurred between ritual and result.
Ritual and result.
Yes. The physical actions like prayer or fasting or pilgrimage, they have been hollowed out. They have become mere habits, cultural performances, or isolated physical exercises.
They're just going through the motions.
Exactly. The communities argue endlessly about the mechanics of the ritual, how exactly to place your hands during prayer, how many syllables to recite, the precise minute the fast begins, but the underlying purpose of the training has completely evaporated from the collective consciousness.
So they're practicing the rigorous discipline of not drinking water, but they haven't connected that discipline to the broader social physics of not stealing from their neighbor.
Exactly. They view the water as a religious issue, but the business transaction as a separate secular issue where the rules of accountability no longer apply.
That is the core of the critique.
If the ritual were truly connected to the concept of universal accountability, the source argues society would not be full of corruption.
Right.
A person who genuinely believes that every action has an inescapable mathematical consequence in the system of social physics wouldn't just avoid water in a locked room. They would avoid exploiting their fellow human beings in the marketplace with the exact same level of terror and discipline.
Because the ritual has become completely severed from the reason it was instituted.
Yes. It is like an athlete who spends all day doing push-ups but never actually steps onto the field to play the game.
Which brings up a fascinating historical dilemma. If this law of consequences, this complex system of social physics, is so absolute and requires such high-level rational deduction, how is it proven to people historically?
That's the big question.
Because looking back through the annals of human history, religion almost always sells itself on magic, spectacle, and the suspension of physical laws, not on mathematical sociology. And that takes us into the source's linguistic deep dive into verse 101, which contrasts the 9 signs of Moses with the proofs of the Quran.
This is a pivotal transition in the lecture. Verse 101 mentions the 9 signs given to Moses. Now, a traditional Orthodox reading views these 9 signs as physical, supernatural miracles.
Like a wooden staff literally transmuting into a living snake.
Right. A human hand radiating blinding light, the physical waters of a sea splitting apart to form walls. But the speaker in our source material views this through the lens of the human intellectual progression we established earlier.
Wait, the transition from childhood to adulthood.
Yes. The seeker argues that in the past, during the time of Moses and Pharaoh, humanity was still in its deep intellectual infancy. They were, societally speaking, children.
And how do you convince a child?
Exactly. You cannot sit a child down and explain the macroeconomic benefits of a centralized justice system.
No, they'd fall asleep.
Children are convinced by visual spectacle. They needed physical, awe-inspiring signs that broke the laws of nature to be shocked out of their complacency and forced to pay attention to the messenger.
They needed the magic tricks to dazzle the eyes before they would even listen to the words.
Exactly. But the text argues by the time of the Quran's revelation, humanity had fundamentally evolved. The era of the station master and the era of physical miracles were definitively over.
So what replaced it?
The text draws a very sharp distinction here. The signs, or ayat in Arabic, of the Quran are no longer magical illusions designed to bypass the intellect. They are themselves intellectual, rational proofs designed to engage and convince the mature mind.
I found the source's analogy for this incredibly striking. The speaker uses a modern scientist to explain this shift in what constitutes proof.
It is a very clarifying analogy. The speaker says that if you were to show a modern, rational scientist a magic trick today, say, waving a wand and pulling a live rabbit out of an empty hat,
Right.
that scientist would never drop to their knees and accept that as proof of a divine societal law. They wouldn't view it as a miracle, they would view it as an illusion.
Because their mature mind would immediately look for the hidden mechanism, the trapdoor, the sleight of hand. A mature intellect demands logical cause and effect, not suspension of reality.
Precisely. So the miracle of the Quran, according to this rationalist framework, isn't that it breaks the laws of physics. The miracle is its unbreakable logic, its terrifyingly deep understanding of human psychology, and its perfectly calibrated laws for maintaining societal equilibrium.
The proof is in the math, not the magic.
Exactly. And the text frames the historical clash between Moses and Pharaoh to highlight this evolution of proof. It reframes the story from a simple wizard battle of staffs turning into snakes into a profound clash of socio-economic systems.
This was one of the most compelling parts of the lecture. When Moses brings his proofs to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's immediate reaction is to dismiss Moses as bewitched or insane.
He tries to discredit the messenger's mental state.
But the source text focuses heavily on Moses' counter-argument. Moses looks at Pharaoh and says, "You know these are clear proofs." Moses isn't saying, "You know my magic is stronger than your magician's magic." He is saying, "You understand the sociological math I am showing you. You see the undeniable logic of this equitable system."
And that raises the critical question. If Pharaoh's intellect recognizes the math is correct, why does he violently reject it?
Why?
The source argues he rejects it out of sheer arrogance and a desperate, calculated desire to maintain his exploitative capitalist system.
Let's explore the mechanics of that exploitation, because it is crucial to understanding the physics of the collapse. Pharaoh isn't just a guy with a bad attitude. He represents an entire institutional structure.
Yes, Pharaoh sits at the very apex of a societal pyramid that relies entirely on the subjugation and extracted labor of a marginalized underclass. In this historical case, the Israelites.
Right.
His wealth, his military power, his godlike status all require that the masses remain oppressed and convinced of their own inferiority. If Pharaoh publicly accepts Moses' rational system, a system based on human equality, equitable distribution of resources, and a single law that applies equally to the king and the peasant,
then Pharaoh's entire power structure evaporates overnight.
Exactly. So he intentionally gaslights Moses. He publicly calls him a madman, not because he actually believes Moses is crazy, but because acknowledging Moses' sanity would cost him his empire.
He chooses to walk down the right-hand path of the signpost, fully knowing it leads off the cliff, because that walk to the right is currently lined with gold and sycophants.
And the inevitable result of ignoring those mathematical proofs is exactly what the social physics predict: utter destruction. Verses 103 and 104 describe how Pharaoh tries to solve the ideological threat by physically expelling Moses and his people from the land. But ultimately, Pharaoh's oppressive system is destroyed.
But again, relying on our framework, the source does not frame this destruction as God sitting on a throne, getting angry at Pharaoh's insults, and zapping him with a lightning bolt, right?
No, not at all. The destruction is framed as the inevitable structural consequence of a society built on exploitation. Think of it like engineering.
Okay.
If you build a massive skyscraper using rotten steel and crumbling concrete, the building isn't collapsing because gravity is angry at the architect.
No, it collapses because the physical stress exceeded the structural integrity.
Right. Pharaoh's society was rotten at its foundation. The internal contradictions, the wealth disparity, the mass resentment, it all reached a breaking point, and the system collapsed under its own oppressive weight.
And here is where the text issues a chilling, incredibly relevant warning. The speaker points out that the Quran is not just telling a historical story. It is warning the listeners.
It is warning everyone.
It is warning the Israelites who historically inherited the land, and it is warning any modern society reading the text. The law of social physics is entirely impartial. It has no favorites.
It is a ruthless impartiality. The text argues that if the formerly oppressed people, the Israelites or the early Muslims or any revolutionary group, are given power, and they decide to adopt the exact same oppressive, exploitative economic methods that Pharaoh used, they will face the exact same destruction.
They don't get a free pass just because they hold the title of the chosen people or because they recite the correct religious slogans.
Absolutely not. The text uses the historical archetype of the wandering Jew to illustrate this principle. If a society abandons the rational law of justice and equity, they will be fractured, scattered, and destroyed.
And again, this isn't a divine vendetta. It is the sheer impartial physics of societal laws. The law does not care about the label you put on your country or the religious symbols on your flags. It only cares about the systemic actions of your institutions.
Which brings us to a massive logistical question.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if the intellectual proofs of this system are so clear and the mathematical threat of societal collapse is so absolute, why didn't the Quran just drop all the rules, the entire Constitution, on society in a single day?
Oh, that's a great point. If the math is perfect, why not just publish the textbook immediately? Why did it take 23 years of gradual revelation to deliver the message?
That is the core of the strategy of incremental change, which the source addresses when looking at verses 105 and 106.
Let's dive into that.
Verse 106 explicitly states that the Quran was revealed in stages, gradually, specifically so that it could be recited to the people slowly and deliberately. The source emphasizes that the Quran is not just a collection of personal, spiritual maxims for individual enlightenment.
It
is a comprehensive blueprint for a complete socio-economic and political revolution. And history proves that you cannot enact a lasting revolution overnight.
Because it is fundamentally a problem of human psychology. The text makes the argument that you have to fundamentally rewire the internal environment, the heart, the mind, the values of a people, before you can successfully change their external environment.
Yes. The speaker goes very deep into the psychology of change here. He argues that human beings are deeply entrenched creatures of habit.
We really are.
We are stubbornly attached to our cultural customs, our inherited economic advantages, and our familiar social hierarchies. If an authority figure tries to force a completely new, radical, equitable system on a population instantly without taking the time to fundamentally change how they think and what they value, the population will not embrace it.
They will reject it violently. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I love the analogy the text uses here about the city infrastructure. It is so pragmatic.
The street names analogy.
Yeah. The speaker says, imagine if the government suddenly decides to change the names of all the major streets in a city like Lahore overnight. They just put up new signs while everyone is sleeping.
Have you actually changed the city?
No. The people waking up the next morning will still navigate using the old names. They will still give directions using the old landmarks. All the government has done is create mass confusion and frustration.
It is a perfect analogy for legislative overreach. If you enforce drastic, sweeping laws instantly, without educating the public, without shifting their internal psychological map to match the new external rules, you do not get a revolution, you get a riot.
A riot versus a revolution.
Yes. The Urdu word the speaker uses in the text is fasad, which implies deep social chaos and corruption.
So the difference is entirely in the preparation of the mind.
That is the crux of it. A true, enduring revolution requires the people to internalize the values of the new system so deeply that they become the willing enforcers of it upon themselves. The people must want the justice the law provides more than they want the chaotic freedom of their old habits. And achieving that level of internalization requires a slow, deliberate, agonizingly patient educational process.
The source takes a really fascinating pivot here to make a sharp, almost aggressive critique of the current generation and how education, or the lack of it, is handled today.
It is a fiery critique. The speaker laments a phenomenon that is universally recognizable. You constantly hear older generations complaining that the youth are disrespectful, that they have lost their moral compass, that they are unruly, selfish, and chaotic.
You hear that everywhere.
But the speaker turns the mirror around on the older generation and asks a devastating question. Who educated them for the last 25 years?
Oof. That is heavy. The youth didn't drop out of a vacuum.
Exactly. The youth did not manifest these behaviors out of thin air. They are the direct, localized product of the educational, economic, and social environment created and maintained by the older generation. The source argues that the gradual implementation of a divine law, the 23-year model of the Quran, demands taking absolute, unwavering responsibility for the step-by-step psychological education of the next generation.
So if the youth are corrupt, it is not a failure of the youth. It is a failure of the older generation who neglected to patiently, incrementally install the software of rational accountability into their minds.
They wanted a shortcut.
Right. They tried to demand respect through sudden, overnight authority rather than building it through decades of consistent, lived example and education.
It is the profound difference between screaming at a plant to grow faster because you're impatient and taking the disciplined time to water the soil every single day for years.
So when that agonizingly slow process of education actually works, when you have successfully watered the soil for years and a highly rational person finally truly grasps the absolute truth of these societal laws, what does that moment of realization actually look like?
It's dramatic.
Because the text describes a reaction that is incredibly dramatic, and it leads us into the concept of intellectual surrender in verses 107 to 109.
This is perhaps the most emotionally resonant and philosophically beautiful part of the lecture. The speaker focuses on verse 107, which describes those who are given prior knowledge, the scholars, the thinkers, the people who have been wrestling with the problems of humanity.
Okay.
The verse says that when they hear the absolute truth of the Quranic message, they fall down on their faces in prostration. Now, staying true to the rationalist framework, the source pushes back incredibly hard against the purely physical, mutualistic interpretation of this verse.
Right. He argues that the verse is not just describing a physical bowing motion, like a choreographed routine in a mosque.
Yeah.
It is not about the angle of your spine.
Correct. The speaker argues this imagery represents something much more profound: intellectual surrender. I want you to imagine you are a person of deep intellect. Perhaps you are a philosopher, a sociologist, or an economist.
Okay, I'm with you.
For decades, you have been desperately searching for the unifying theory of human society. You have been trying to figure out a way to perfectly balance economic justice, individual human rights, and collective security. You have struggled with the endless contradictions and selfishness of human behavior.
You have been staring at a chalkboard full of unsolvable equations for your entire life.
Exactly. And then suddenly, the perfect rational framework is presented to you. The Constitution is laid out. It clicks. Every single piece of the puzzle falls into place. The logic of cause and effect is so undeniable, so breathtakingly perfect and comprehensive that your intellectual ego completely collapses.
Wow.
You realize that your own theories were flawed and the system is flawless. Your mind bows down to the sheer majesty of the truth. That ego death, that awe in the face of a perfect system, is intellectual surrender.
It is not a surrender born of fear or physical force or the threat of a sword. It is the surrender of a mathematician finally seeing a flawless, elegant equation that explains the universe. But the text doesn't stop at just mental acknowledgement. It brings up this incredibly vivid emotional imagery in verse 109. It says, these intellectuals, as they surrender, weep. They fall down weeping.
And the speaker asks, why are they crying? Because, as the source explains, they aren't crying out of physical weakness. They aren't crying out of some vague, mystical sentimentality or fear of ghosts.
No, their tears are rooted in something much heavier. They're crying because they possess deep empathy and terrifying foresight.
Exactly.
Because they finally understand the perfect math of societal survival, it means they can also clearly see the math of societal destruction. They look around at their own people, their own neighbors who are still trapped in ignorance, still exploiting each other, still ignoring the signposts, and joyfully walking toward the cliff.
I mean, I thought about this deeply, and I kept coming back to the analogy of a modern climate scientist.
Oh, that's a powerful one.
Imagine a scientist who has dedicated their life to studying atmospheric models. They receive a new set of data that definitively proves an irreversible tipping point has been crossed. They look at the screen, and they just break down in tears.
Right.
They aren't crying because they are personally weak or because they are frightened of a thunderstorm outside. They are crying because they fully mathematically understand the disaster that is coming in 20 years.
They see the rising sea levels, the failing crops, the mass displacement of millions of people, and then they look out their window and see politicians arguing about minor tax cuts and the public completely ignoring the reality.
Their hearts are breaking for the collective, unavoidable fate of humanity. It is the absolute agony of knowing.
That is a phenomenal, haunting, modern equivalent. The tears mentioned in verse 109 are tears of profound societal empathy. It is the heavy, isolating burden of the adulthood we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
When you finally read the timetable yourself, And you realize with absolute certainty that the entire town is about to miss the last train out of a disaster zone, and you know they won't listen to your warnings, it breaks you.
So recognizing this perfect mathematical law of societal survival and feeling the crushing tragedy of humanity ignoring it leads us to the ultimate conclusion of Surah 17.
The final verses.
If the law is this mathematically perfect, how do we define the source of that law? How does the text describe the lawgiver himself? This brings us to verses 110 and 111 and the concept of the majesty of a self-sustaining law.
The source moves to verse 110, which contains a specific instruction. Say, call upon Allah, or call upon the most merciful, or Rahman. Whichever name you call, to him belong the best names.
Okay, so names of God.
Right. And the speaker in the lecture uses this verse to make a very sharp, critical point about how human beings constantly obsess over the superficial trappings of religion while ignoring the substance.
We obsess over the syllables instead of the system.
Precisely. People get fiercely caught up in fighting over the specific linguistic sounds of God's names rather than trying to manifest the actual attributes those names represent in their society.
The source shares a pointed, real-world historical anecdote here about East Pakistan, which is modern-day Bangladesh, to illustrate how petty the religious mindset can become. Detail this anecdote for us, because it really exposes the absurdity of ritualistic gatekeeping.
The speaker recalls a period when certain Orthodox religious figures in West Pakistan fiercely criticized the people of East Pakistan, the Bengalis, for having names that sounded un-Islamic to their ears.
Un-Islamic sounding names.
Right. For example, criticizing a Bengali name that used a localized, perhaps Sanskrit-derived word for a divine attribute like mercy or creator, rather than using the pure classical Arabic equivalent.
Wow.
The speaker mocks this linguistic arrogance. He says these critics completely, tragically missed the entire essence of the religion. They were ready to excommunicate millions of people over the phonetic pronunciation of syllables, completely ignoring the only metric that actually matters, whether the society itself was manifesting the attributes of mercy, justice, and equitable sustenance.
Oh, absolutely. The Quran in verse 110 is essentially saying, use whatever name you want, call him Allah or Rahman or Khuda. The phonetic sound vibrating in your throat doesn't matter. What matters is that the ultimate authority embodies the highest, most perfect attributes of justice, and your human society must strive to reflect those attributes in your laws and economics.
It is like violently arguing over the font a recipe is printed in while the kitchen is actively burning down. Who cares if the recipe is in Arial or Times New Roman if you aren't actually baking the bread?
That's a great way to look at it. And this critique of human compartmentalization brings us to the grand finale of the surah, verse 111. The analysis here is crucial to the whole rationalist framework.
It really ties it all together.
The verse says, praise to Allah, who has not taken a son and has had no partner in his dominion. Now, traditionally, this verse is seen purely as a theological rebuttal.
Right, seen as a direct refutation of specific beliefs of other religions, like Christianity's concept of the Son of God or polytheistic pantheons.
But in the socioeconomic, rationalist framework of this source, why does the Quran emphasize this so heavily? What is the functional, systemic meaning of the lawgiver not having a son or a partner?
It is about establishing the absolute, unassailable perfection of the system of law. Think about it logically in terms of human governance. Why does a human king desperately need a son?
He needs a son to ensure succession.
Because the king is a biological creature who is mortal and will eventually die. The system is fragile, so it needs a backup generator.
And why does a king need partners, ministers, or a cabinet of helpers?
Because the king's intellect is limited, his physical energy is limited, and his geographic reach is limited. He has profound weaknesses and blind spots that he must compensate for by sharing his power with others.
So when the text emphatically states that the lawgiver has no son and no partner, it isn't just a theological debate. It is a declaration that the law itself is immortal and structurally flawless.
Exactly. A perfect, self-sustaining law of social physics doesn't need offspring to take over the throne because the law never ages and never dies.
Right.
It doesn't need a cabinet of helpers or partners because it has no intellectual blind spots or limits to its jurisdiction. Gravity doesn't need a vice president of gravity to help pull apples to the ground on the other side of the planet.
It is a complete, closed-loop, perfectly calibrated system of cause and effect.
Right.
To suggest that God has a partner is to suggest that the system of law is somehow deficient, flawed, and needs external human or supernatural assistance to function properly.
And the text points out that humans constantly try to invent partners for God precisely because they want a loophole in the law.
Loophole.
Yeah. If the king is perfectly strict and cannot be bribed, maybe you can bribe the prince. If the law of cause and effect is absolute, maybe you can find a saint, a demigod, or a religious leader who can intercede for you, pull some strings, and get you off the hook.
That is the corrupt core of it. Creating partners in divinity is humanity's clever attempt to create a political bypass around the strict, terrifying accountability of cause and effect. And the speaker uses a fantastic, sharply humorous anecdote to satirize how humans attempt to divide this sovereignty to protect their own earthly interests.
The inheritance satire. I love this story. So the speaker tells a story about two brothers who have to divide their deceased father's property.
Right.
One brother, trying to sound incredibly magnanimous, generous, and pious, turns to the other and says, "Listen, I am going to be very fair about this division. I will just take the physical courtyard and the roof of the house."
Sounds reasonable so far.
And then he says, "You can have absolutely everything from the roof all the way up to the sky."
Wow. So basically nothing.
It is a brilliant, biting piece of satire. The first brother takes all the actual tangible, economically useful property on Earth and generously grants the other brother millions of miles of empty, unusable space in the heavens.
That is incredible. The source uses this story to mock the traditional religious mindset that tries to divide God's sovereignty. People say, oh yes, God is the supreme ruler of the heavens. God controls the orbits of the stars, the movements of the angels, and the distribution of heaven and hell in the afterlife.
But when it comes to the earth, when it comes to the economy, the political systems, the courts, the courtyard, and the roof, humans say, we will handle this part. Your divine laws of equity don't apply to our banking systems. Our man-made laws apply here.
You can have absolute dominion over everything above the roof, God, but the bank accounts, the real estate, and the legal courts down here are ours. It is complete compartmentalization of reality designed to protect human greed.
And that profound critique leads to the final, powerful redefinition in the text. The concept of takbir, the act of saying Allahu Akbar, which translates to God, is great.
The speaker argues that this phrase, meant to be a revolutionary declaration, has been tragically reduced to a hollow physical ritual.
Exactly. People argue endlessly in the mosques. How many times exactly should we say Allahu Akbar in a specific prayer? Where exactly should our hands be placed when we say it? Above the navel, below the navel, resting on the chest.
Again, obsessing over the physical mechanics of the ritual while remaining completely blind to the engine of the philosophy.
Exactly. The source argues that true takbir is not a phonetic sound you make with your vocal cords. True takbir means practically, physically establishing the sovereignty of this rational, equitable law on earth.
It means building a socio-economic society where no human being holds dominion, exploitative power, or tyrannical authority over another human being. Because the supreme impartial law is the only recognized authority.
When a society eradicates poverty, when it establishes unshakable justice, when it ensures the dignity and provision of every single citizen, that action is the true declaration that God is great.
Right.
Shouting Allahu Akbar from a towering minaret while the society below rots from inequality, corruption, and starvation is nothing but an empty, hypocritical echo.
So what does this all mean? If we pull all these massive threads together from this intense philosophical lecture on the end of Surah 17, it means moving away from a religion of magical thinking.
It means abandoning the comfort of waiting for station masters to tell us what to do, or waiting for miraculous angels to fix our problems.
It means realizing that performing empty physical rituals will never appease the laws of social physics. Instead, it means embracing a practical, living system. It means growing up.
It means taking the terrifying but absolutely necessary step of reading the timetable ourselves, stripping away the loopholes we've invented, and committing to the agonizing work of building a society based on empathy, reason, and the absolute conviction that our actions have inescapable consequences.
It is the ultimate Quranic call to intellectual and societal maturity. The training wheels must come off if we are ever going to actually ride.
They absolutely must.
Which brings us to the end of this specific exploration. Learner, we have reached the end of the analysis for this chapter in the materials you sent us. But looking ahead at the rest of the syllabus you provided, the journey is far from over.
While we have reached the end of the folders in your current directory, the master list reminds us that 2 lectures remain.
In Lecture 1617, we will synthesize the overarching constitution of Surah 17, gathering all these laws of social physics into a cohesive whole and preparing ourselves for the cave of knowledge that awaits us in the next chapter, Surah 18.
And as we close this session, I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to mull over, building directly on the philosophy we explored today. Look around at our modern, technologically advanced world.
Okay.
If a society today, despite all its science and data, still waits passively for a political savior or an economic miracle or some sudden technological magic to miraculously fix its deep-seated crises of inequality and climate collapse, rather than taking the heavy step-by-step responsibility to establish a rational, equitable cause and effect system.
Are they still trapped in the childhood of humanity?
Exactly. What would it actually take for our modern world to finally, truly grow up?
A question that demands an answer from all of us, not in words, but in how we build our future. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, remember that the training wheels are off. The balance is entirely up to you. Keep diving deep, and we will see you next time.